Tomb Raider, The Angel of Darkness, adapted from the novelization by J.R. Milward, based on an original story by A. Murti Schofield, with J.R. Milward and Adamm Khuevrr, with music by Pieter and Martin Iverson. Episode 19.
You'd better. No, I hadn't imagined it. Miss Hardboiled herself, concerned about me? It had been a long, long time since anyone had given a damn about my well-being. The fact that the remark was coming from a woman who held a gun to my head only a few hours before only added to the irony. Mind you, she might have at least left me that machine gun of hers behind. Considering our foes, I probably needed it more than she did right now. My annoyance gave way to satisfaction. At least Eckhart wouldn't have everything going his way with Lara around. The woman had a talent for causing disruption. She was also a survivor.
I saw you.
I was practically kicking myself for getting captured. It should have been obvious I was walking into a trap. From the moment the guards had ambushed me out in the corridor to the amateurish way that allowed me to advance. When I was picking them off, darting from one point of cover to the next, a second team had snuck up under my guard. The cheer guy had been my only warning, but even so, we were 2 foes against 20. My realization that they all wore rebreather masks came too late. By then, the gas had already started to overcome me. I'd recognized the leader, Gunderson, from dossiers in the deep web that I trawled up during my extra-legal years between mercenary outfits. Though I'd not known him in person, he had lived up to his reputation. The man was as cold as a Wisconsin winter. He barely even looked at me as he dragged my half-drugged ass along by my ankle and bound me with ropes as easily as if I'd weighed 5 kilos instead of my actual 85. As has been noted, I'm not a wimpy guy, but Gunderson had made me feel like a 7-year-old standing next to a Hummer. My ribs ached from the beatings and from being jostled around whilst dangling from Gunderson's shoulders. Drug gas had made me too groggy to put up more than token resistance. Weird tastes and phantom sensations had come and gone, dulling my perception of time. I'd been only vaguely aware of Carell's presence as they had talked over me and confiscated my gun. Demonstrating more than even its usual good sense, the cheer guy had hidden itself under my shirt, in the hollow of my back where it sat as quiet as a mouse. I'd felt its regret and helplessness at not having the means to carry me out of there by itself. And then Eckhart had arrived. I sensed him as a sickness in my head that overruled every other sensation. Being so close to my father's killer, and yet unable to even think for the pain, had been a physical and emotional torture. The Proto's presence in the ether had been as hungry and urgent as a sawtooth dagger. But Eckhart's was something else entirely. A corruption so absolute that it writhed and burrowed like maggots through my spirit. It was like being buried alive in a tide of rotten filth. Even my normal senses had been overwhelmed to the point of agony. Despite the fog of drug-induced torpor, I was screaming as he probed me with instruments and hands in the drenching oblivion of his will. At that moment, I realized how stupid I'd been to think I could take on Eckhart alone. He'd already butchered his way through the ranks of the Lux Veritatis adepts, all of whom had decades of experience to draw upon. A punk like me, expecting to match mind on mind against this creature, was suddenly laughable, and had been the height of arrogance for me to imagine otherwise. Imprisoning him for all those centuries had only pushed him further into the depths of insanity, and it was from there that his gruesome efficiency drew its strength. He had picked my mind apart, piece by piece, easily dismantling my defenses and laughing at my rage. The physical assaults on my body were meaningless compared to the way he stripped away my thoughts. His amusement became almost whimsical as I felt him bring forth my memories of my 19-year-old self and the way I had vowed to never get involved with the Shadow War. As a young man, I had fled the conflict and cursed my gifts, the inheritance of the sight that had seemed a freakish burden rather than an asset to be treasured. It was that very inheritance that made me so vulnerable to Eckhart's influence, and that would have saved me had I not abandoned my training. My final kernel of strength was almost gone when Eckhart showed me what he had done to my father. My memory became a little unreliable after that. But then, guard had appeared to say that Lara had been sighted, and my torture had, reluctantly, withdrawn. Bless her. My only wish now was that I'd have the chance to thank her one day. The beast, Boaz, finally finished its grisly work and noticed my presence. If I was to stand even a chance of surviving, I'd have to get my scrambled head back together, fast. I backed off, careful not to let myself be cornered, and observed my opponent. Her carapace was mottled brown, with a toadstool-speckled underbelly and legs that were black as polished jet. Her hind end sported a bulbous tail studded with meter-long spines. In a sickening rush, I realized that I had absolutely no idea what manner of creature this was, and I didn't have a clue how to kill her. The head tilted, clacking its pincers, and suddenly I had no time to note anything except how quickly I could dodge. Her jaws opened, peeling apart like the skin of rotten fruit, and the sickly sweet stench increased. I had just enough warning to get clear before the thing spat a globule of phlegm right where I'd been standing. In horror, I watched as the green goo hissed, dissolving the concrete wall as if it were hot water on sugar. Enraged at having missed, the beast bellowed. I didn't hang around. I was always good at running. In the Legion, I ran for at least 8 kilometers a day, 4 on my days off. My training had placed more emphasis on endurance over sprinting, but even so, I could really move when the situation demanded it. My head was already clearing, and the exercise helped to purge the last of the drugs from my system. Running also helped to push aside the memories. I was damned if I was going to let Eckhart beat me this way. We resorted to a game of cat and mouse, quickly establishing that Boaz's bulk made her considerably slower on the turns than on a straight line. I could dart in and out of her field of view with ease, and her reactions were sluggish. Nevertheless, I couldn't get overconfident. After only 2 or 3 minutes, the walls and floor had become pockmarked with liquefied holes, and the beast didn't even seem close to running out of juice. Her tail narrowly missed killing me with a dead-on swipe, and I decided to change tactics. She was losing patience, growing angrier every second. I'd mapped out her weaknesses. If I left it any longer, I would start to tire, and she obviously had a lot more in the way of reserves than I did. After all, she'd just eaten a decent meal. I flung my hand out in a ripping gesture, and the nearest ladder exploded away from the wall, taking part of the gantry with it. Grunting with effort, I managed to wrench off a long strut just as the beast lumbered over, her jaws opening like giant bolt cutters to slice me in half. But then she reared up, squealing in pain as I jammed the metal through the back of her throat. A twist, and the metal snapped in two. I hit the deck and scrambled clear with about 3 feet of steel still clutched in my fist. Her pincers went berserk trying to pull the strut free, but it was lodged too deeply and she couldn't get a grip. I didn't wait, but freed the Chiragai just as I took a flying leap onto her back. Her armor felt like rubber-coated roof tiles. Before she could react, I'd plunged the metal spike into a chink between the armor plates. I pulled and wrenched the plates apart just as the Chiragai sailed past me like a golden cannonball and plunged into quivering, custard-colored flesh. The beast screamed and I tumbled down, landing heavily on my shoulder. I flung myself aside just as a clawed foot stabbed down where my stomach had been a nanosecond before. Ducking, I crawled through the tangle of thrashing limbs and managed to get clear. Sweat ran into my eyes. Some of the corrosive slime had dripped onto my shirt, burning holes through the cloth, but fortunately missing the skin. Panting and triumphant, I watched until the beast finished its twitching, arched its back, and fell still. A flap of torn exoskeleton burst open, and the Chiragai flew out in a shower of light, shedding gore like water off a hot skillet. I couldn't help but smile as it returned to my hand, radiating smugness. That's how we kill monsters. Dead, it could be a foam rubber creation from Stan Winston's special effects studio, although there wasn't a rating in the world that would sanction it being used in a movie. It was over. I'd won. Christ, I could have murdered a beer. What's wrong? I stopped in my tracks, the Chiragai suddenly growing hot in my hand. Then I heard it. A chittering, squelching hiss. A lump of dread settled in my stomach as I turned. The corpse rocked and its bloated abdomen bulged outwards, reminding me all too vividly of a certain breakfast scene aboard the Nostromo. Yeah, and that had turned out so well. Damn, why aren't these things ever simple? I backed off, wishing I had another metal pole to hand, but the beast had rolled over as it died and crushed the mangled ladder beneath its bulk. The hiss suddenly climbed to a screech of fury. As I watched in horror, a bone-white spear, longer than my arm and jointed like a mantis's claw, burst out of the beast's underside. It was followed by a human-like hand, whose fingers scrabbled away slices of dead flesh as something wriggled and tore its way from the beast's innards. The claw made a lunging stab, punching through the concrete floor like styrofoam, and used the leverage to drag its body through the bloody opening. I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to vomit. A head, covered in raven black hair and slick with gore, looked up at me and screamed. Its wasp-like body staggered and fragile-looking, insectile wings unfolded from its shoulders. The horror's eyes were glittering, compound globes in the mouth. When it opened, sprouted rows of needle teeth and a prehensile tongue thick with slime. I took a step back, then another. Os veritatis mecum. Breathe. Relax. Os veritatis mecum. Calmness settled around me like the folds of a warm cloak, aided by the presence in my hand. This was nothing I couldn't handle. I've already killed 2 monsters today, on top of Eckhart's spiritual flaying. This 2-bit reject from the fly wasn't about to spoil my day. Yeah, pleased to meet you too. Suddenly it pounced, claws extended. In a blur, I brought my hand up, and the Chiragai's gold met slimy bone. Its tongue lolled, covering me with saliva. I felt my arms beginning to sag. The creature's hot breath washed over me, ranker than a sewer, and it leaned its body into mine, increasing the pressure. Damn, but it was strong. Christ! At the last moment, I deliberately let my leg give way as the Chirigai ignited in fury. The creature toppled forwards, sailing harmlessly overhead, and howled like a baby as it clutched at the stump where its hand had been. I scrambled as it lunged with that wicked long claw. Its face was incapable of expression, but I decided it looked even more pissed than before. Suddenly I felt it. A powerful stirring in the air, like the sensation before a thunderstorm. The hairs on my arm leapt to attention. Oh, shit. Let me tell you, it hurt. A lot. When I was 10, I'd accidentally gotten caught in an electrified fence while crossing between cattle fields on a friend's farm. The charge had been relatively minor, but I still had the burn marks to show for it. This was the same sensation multiplied by 2 or 3 times. I tried to scream, but my muscles had completely seized up. The smell of singed hair filled my nose, but for a wild moment my brain registered it as cotton candy instead. A jolt like that screws up the whole nervous system, top to bottom. It lasted barely a second, but totally floored me. Gasping, I realized that I'd been holding the Chirigai, and that its embossed designs were now burned forever onto my palm. For a wild moment, I thanked God I'd not gotten that piercing Alexis had suggested. Bitch! The creature had climbed to its feet and was stalking me, prowling in slow circles around her victim. Victim be damned. She was going to die. It happened so fast that I barely registered it. 1 second she was frozen, sizing me up as I staggered upright. The next, she was springing towards me, sweeping her claw around to take my head off. It takes a special kind of crazy to stand your ground against demonic mosquito women. I ducked the arc of her claw and stabbed out with my right fist, the one still holding the Chirigai, and immediately felt it sink through layers of hot, yielding flesh. It hurt so much, but I resolutely tightened my grip. The creature twisted and fought, but nothing could disengage her. I turned my face aside, pointlessly trying to avoid the blood already drenching my entire front. But gradually, the creature's motion subsided. Its body slumped as I fought, and lost the battle to stay upright. Groaning, I collapsed to my knees, bearing the dying beast to the ground. I felt numbed, too focused on her heart thumping in my grasp to care about the rest of the world. It seemed to take forever, but slowly, the beats grew fainter, and the fountain of blood dwindled to a trickle. I was shaking, my victory slowly taking shape as I pulled my hand away. The body fell back, limp as a piece of butcher's meat. I'd done it. For the second time. Suddenly, I laughed. It couldn't be helped. My whole body looked like I'd been spray-coated scarlet and stank worse than an abattoir in high summer. I could have passed for a monster myself, with my teeth gleaming white through the smeared gore as I laughed and grinned and laughed some more at the sheer joy of being alive. The core of my being, battered but intact after Eckhart's ravages, swelled until I thought I would burst. 3 abominations in one day. Even my father would have been impressed. Unsteadily, I got to my feet. It hurt when I tried to scry further than a couple of meters. My body was one big ball of pain. But Lara still needed me, and I wouldn't be satisfied with my work until I saw Eckhart's body with my own eyes. My boots made sucking sounds as I staggered through the bloody puddles. A quick check confirmed that 2 of the ladders were still intact and could be used to reach the balcony. I smiled, imagining Lara's reaction when I turned up. It happened then. So gently that I almost didn't feel it. In confusion, I turned, wondering why the Chirurgai had suddenly blazed into life without my consent. It flashed across my vision like a vengeful comet. Until I saw the shattered, blood-soaked remains that had crawled up behind me. A severed head with glittering compound eyes went bouncing off into the shadows. Only then did I notice the meter-long claw sticking through my belly. Huh. That's not good. The Chirurgai sailed overhead as the chamber rolled upwards. Or perhaps it was me falling. It's okay, I wanted to say. But my mouth refused to work properly. Alexis might have called it an improvement. A bastard. Details slid away as I tried to pin them down. But the floor felt so deliciously comfortable, even with my cheek cushioned in still warm blood. And I was so damn tired.
You'd better.
The memory of Lara's voice yelled in my ear. As in a rush of regret, it all came back to me. Damn, was my last thought, as the darkness rushed up and claimed me with open arms.
A stitch wrenched at my cracked ribs, and doubt nipped at my heels. But I didn't dare slow my pursuit. The corridor forked for the 5th time. As always, I instinctively chose the path that headed down. Bare rock replaced concrete and tiles, and the lights dwindled to lonely bulbs every 10 meters or so. Every shadow was a figure lurking in wait. But I passed them all by, my guns darting and dismissing every false enemy almost as soon as it appeared. My main concern was not Eckhart himself, but the horde of unknowns that lay between us, most especially Gunderson and his men. I had no illusions about my plan. Taking on Eckhart might be just as dangerous as walking into a dragon's lair, but at least he was one foe instead of many. I wasn't in any shape to face the entire Strahov security force in a head-on battle. It lifted my spirits somewhat to remember that, in point of fact, I had actually walked into a real dragon's lair once, and survived. On the other hand, getting caught in a crossfire with 30 or 40 expectant guardsmen, particularly in these narrow, twisting tunnels, would be disappointingly fatal. There was a jumble of different footprints in the dust. The most recent had been made by high-quality leather Oxfords, with a brisk but deliberate stride. Eckhart, I thought, and quickened my step. To my unspoken relief, I saw no signs of Gunderson. A man built to his scale would be wearing custom-fitted army boots and leave footprints the size of golf bunkers. The air grew warmer. I felt sweat collect on my upper lip and stick to my back. I wondered just how far I had come under the streets of Prague. Kurtis's words came back to me, as vividly as if he was whispering them into my ear.
Eckhart guards the shard in his old alchemy lab in the lower regions. He must be stabbed with all 3 shards, cursed with some of the Nephilim's immortality. The shards disrupt that power, make him mortal. and vulnerable.
With furious effort, I pushed my thoughts about Kurtis away from my main goal, becoming one with my predatory instincts. Worrying was for later. Now all my focus was on finding that third shard and visiting its justice upon Eckhart. Without warning, the tunnel opened into a roughly hewn chasm. I only just arrested my momentum in time to keep from skidding over the edge and into fathomless black. Gravel skittered and pattered into the depths. If I squinted, I could just make out the suggestion of a reddish glow far below. The faint whiff of crushed and molten rock did not increase my desire to hop down and investigate. Genuine torches dribbled burning pitch and threw shadows like cavorting demons amongst the crags and outcrops. On the opposite side, some 20 meters away, 2 statues guarded a stone arch with the Strahof's snarling lion symbol carved upon its doorway. The statues' right hands were turned towards me in a gesture both of warding and defiance. Their faces were shrouded within the grim depths of their hoods. A rope bridge, barely wide enough for one person, was the only means of crossing. I suppose a simple no entry sign would have been far too déclassé. The bridge swayed, sagging almost a foot before stabilizing. I winced as the hempen ropes audibly creaked with the strain. Clearly, Eckhart did not expect or encourage regular visitors. Gods only knew how the likes of Gunderson ever made it safely across, if he ever merited an invitation. The ropes weren't actually all that old, and I had the suspicious feeling that the bridge was replaced on a regular basis. A third stone figure gazed down disapprovingly at me as, with considerable relief, I stepped back onto solid ground. The smoke and fumes had hidden him from view until I stood in the shadow of the doorway. His torso emerged from above the lintel like a ghost caught and petrified while swooping through the wall, and its chiseled features reminded me not a little of Eckhart himself. Perhaps he had it commissioned when he was younger. Nothing beats giving the old ego a stroke every time you pass by. I tapped at the door, jerking my hand away in shock as a thread of molten metal suddenly split the lion carving in two. The edges glowed red, orange, and finally white, filling the air with smoke. As smoothly as if they were on oiled bearings, the two halves of the doorway rolled apart, their edges still glowing with residual heat. Show off. You know, it's no shame to admit that you're afraid. All this wisecracking cynicism isn't fooling me. Oh, I'm afraid, all right. But since when has that ever stopped me? So far, never. Just remember, you won't be alone down there. We're all with you, Lara. I peered into the darkness, but nothing was lurking in wait. The warmth of a desert wind embraced me, and a bleak smile touched my lips as I clicked the safeties off my weapons. Then let's get this over with. Down I went. The passageway corkscrewed deeper and deeper. Astringent chemical smells wafted from the darkness, caressing the clanking, whirring whispers of machinery. I had reached Eckhart's laboratory. It wasn't a vast room, but what it lacked in size, it more than made up for in macabre eccentricity. Shelves rose to the ceiling and were bowed under the weight of enough books to replenish the vault of trophies 3 times over. Long trestle tables had been set up, with the kind of equipment usually associated with the more intellectual class of drug chemist. Vials glittered and crucibles glowed over flickering, pink-tinged flames. Retorts of every shape and size bubbled and frothed, adding even more fumes to the pall that hung over the entire room like a threatening storm head. I found myself feeling woozy after only a few breaths and gave the benches a wide berth, only to run into more graphic smells. A butcher's table held disturbingly human body parts, neatly dissected, labelled, and jostling for space amid piles of annotated journals. The air was alive with the buzzing of flies. I tried not to dwell on the St. Andrew's cross rack mounted on the wall, or the recent bloodstains, and worse, clogging the nearby drain. The layout seemed to obey Eckhart's rambling whimsy, rather than any logical methodology. A fragile, spun-glass distillation system sat next to a blacksmith's forge, complete with wrought iron tongs, pokers, and, well, you don't want to know. My hair crackled as I walked past a bench laden with steam-driven Tesla coils, connected to a shallow tray of acid. In the tray, frothing and spitting, was an ingot of pure gold. An entire wall was given over to age-blackened wooden panels, dials and levers that might have been the Renaissance's answer to a personal computer. The medieval-style gibbet swung forlornly in one corner. Its skeletal occupant was over-equipped for the human race by 3 heads, 5 arms, and a tail. I was so engrossed with the bizarreness of it all that I nearly tripped over my own feet. Some idiot must have thought cutting long grooves in the floor added to the aesthetic feng shui. The 21st century had obviously given Eckhart plenty of new toys to play with. But where the hell was the shard? I searched the benches and drew a blank. Nor was it cunningly concealed amongst the racks of books. Concern began bubbling within me, until I discovered the annex at the back of the chamber. Eckhart, or a luckless servant, had taken the trouble to excavate most of the floor and line the resulting pit with thick ceramic tiles. The liquid that filled it to the brim rippled sluggishly, an ugly, oily brown that was horribly familiar. Acid. Sulfuric acid. And the bloody shard is right at the bloody bottom. Well, we knew Eckhart was devious. But he must have the means to access the shard whenever he wants. He's a brilliant alchemist, after all. Let me set the record straight. Ravenous wolves don't worry me. Crocodiles run and hide when I'm around, and man-eating mutant mummies would rather throw themselves into lava than pick a fight with me when I'm in a bad mood. Nevertheless, I'm only human, with exactly the same nervous system as every other human on the planet. Certain sounds don't bother to check in with our brains when we hear them, but instead jump straight to the department marked, "What the hell was that?" I dashed over to the scream's source, a narrow doorway on the far wall. Cautiously, I nudged it open and was bathed in bluish-purple light. There were steps leading down, presumably to a sub-basement. I drew my gun just as another cry rent the air.
Guaridi umbris, dormitore scussitare.
I need that shard, and I need it now. Well, that's stating the obvious. Did you have any ideas? Time paused as I took stock of the situation. I was bone tired and starving. It had been days since I'd last slept properly or eaten a square meal. Apart from my trusty tranquilizer gun, my main weapons were dangerously low on ammunition. My clothes were torn and, in places, singed black with soot. The gash on my upper arm was still bleeding, in stubborn defiance of the fact that I'd run out of bandages. The painkillers I'd wolfed down earlier were starting to wear off, and my fractured ribs were making their displeasure abundantly clear. On top of all that, I had over a dozen other cuts, burns, and grazes that, in the chaos of the last 3 days, I'd not had time to attend to. Even my ankle was starting to act up. I must have twisted it when I tripped over. Stupid fool. Well, any ideas? Only one.
Hombres, ad dominum nostrum congruere.
Shivering and biting my lip, I limped towards the circle of light. The ceiling and the speaker were so far above me as to be nearly invisible, but I could see him. A tiny figure in grey, reaching a gloved hand beseechingly up to a contraption hanging before him. Electricity crackled, crisping the air with ozone. I smelled charred hair and scorched insulation. Every few seconds, huge arcs would flash across the divide from glove to machine and scurry across its surface like ants defending their nest.
Wakari nefelim harkasere.
Instinctively, I shielded my eyes. Machine and insane operator were suddenly enveloped in a massive discharge. The combined lightning strikes of an entire storm concentrated into the space of a few heartbeats. The machine roared, almost matching Eckhart in volume, as it lowered its burden in a cradle of cables. And I saw it. Pearlescent skin on a body that might have been the skeleton of an angel glowed and seemed to radiate back every photon of light in the room. Extraordinarily long limbs lent it a preternatural beauty, even as it hung limp and passive within the sparkling restraints. The clawed hands twitched as the electricity played along its nervous system, like a child dreaming in its sleep. There were giants in the earth in those days. The sleeper. An Eckhart, his face transported with ecstasy as he held his gloved hand aloft, screamed with elation, a flash of dancing bronze in his grip. Damn ricochets. Natla was never this awkward. The dazzling light show faded a little, but continued to flicker in Eckhart's eyes as he looked down and spotted me. Amazingly, he smiled and cocked his head, stalking along the gantry towards me. There were several of them winding all the way to the top of the chamber, enclosing the room and the sleeper's casket in crisscrossing, conflicted shadows.
Still alive, Miss Croft. You are resilient.
And impatient. Before I could take another step, Eckhart flicked a disdainful hand at a switch, and the ladders to each walkway retracted out of my reach. I was trapped on the ground, and when I looked up, Eckhart had gone. Only his voice remained.
But still only a mortal, I see. And I'm afraid over the decades I've killed more mortals like you than I can remember.
And stole their body parts, like a cheap grave robber. I spun around, gun in hand, but there was nothing to aim at.
As I now shall take yours.
To wake this thing? You are grotesque.
Only my great arts can cause the higher race to flourish again.
I was ready, or so I thought. My bullet once again hit only thin air and concrete. I could see where Mullah had borrowed his fondness for overblown language, and for talking when he should be killing. As a famous author once pointed out, a bad guy will gloat over the moment of the kill, whereas a good guy will simply kill you. In that sense, I was glad to be facing one of the bad guys. So, I guess it's up to me to stop you then.
The Luxert artists tried for centuries to destroy me, and I hunted down and killed every last one of them. You are nothing to me.
My heart clenched, trying not to think of the man I had left to Boaz's mercy. I felt the weight of Salieah's pendant and drew on my courage. Very slowly, I withdrew the final periapt shard from my pocket and held it up. Whether it was the sleeper or Eckhart's presence, or because all three shards were finally reunited, the blade in my hand began to shine with a halo as pure and beautiful as moonlight. It washed over my spirit like a cool balm, leaving me infused with resolution.
The shards!
Scary, huh? Really, Eckhart? If you wanted to keep the shards safe, you shouldn't have left the key lying around for anyone to use. Well, by key, she means that device taking up most of your lab. You may be a genius at some things, Eckhart, but at others you're a blundering idiot. Anyone could have gotten a shard if they sat down and used their brain for 5 minutes. My ego was too tired to feel insulted. Besides, my subconscious was right. Logic had demanded that Eckhart had to have a way of gaining access to the shard whenever he wanted. The simplest solution would be to neutralize the acid, and that meant having just the right formula within easy reach. Enter Eckhart's Renaissance computer and the pre-cut channels on the floor that I'd quite literally stumbled across in my search. I'm no chemical engineer, but fortunately, Eckhart suffered from the same laziness that affects even the most brilliant minds. Rather than whip up the formula from scratch each time, he had thoughtfully left the right stuff ready for me to dispense with the flick of a few switches. Within moments, a silvery, rippling stuff had dripped out of the machine and along the pre-cut channels scored into the floor, moving with peculiar grace somewhere between a liquid and a vapor. I watched, fascinated, until the formula reached the annex's pit, whereupon the acid had started frothing and churning like a cauldron full of demons. Crackling lights flashed in the depths, and unfathomable smells clouded the chamber. But almost as quickly, the violence had subsided, allowing me to approach. The only thing remaining in the pit had been crystal clear, unadulterated, and 100% safe water. In the silence, I matched Eckhart's glare. My back straightened, and I lost the fake limp. Eckhart sneered and vaulted the railing. He landed on both feet after a 14-meter fall and regarded me without so much as a hair out of place. He advanced slowly. Suddenly, he wasn't an old man anymore, but a demon growing taller with every step. I could see now that his gloved hand was sheathed in a corona of deathly hues. Sickly emerald, congealed yellows, and lurid, mesmeric purple that shone and writhed between his fingers like ribbons of radioactive smoke. A bronze device sat coiled in his grip, but its form kept changing, defying my senses. Its extremities kept vanishing and reappearing at random, sometimes passing right through solid flesh. I had the disconcerting feeling that it was not quite of this reality, and that the languid, sensuous motion was somehow alive. The black alchemist smiled, the sandglyph's emanations casting his cheekbones and teeth into skull-like relief. If I'd thought he was mad before, I could now practically feel his insanity, a nauseous pressure building in my temples, making me break out in sweat. His willpower made the very air vibrate with every perfectly enunciated syllable.
It is my destiny to breed hell on Earth. You cannot stop the Nephilim's ascension, and you cannot kill me. I am immortal!
I suddenly remembered Ludwig's body, cooked beyond all recognition, and Werner's stomach, gushing blood onto the Persian rug as he lay dead in my arms. I backed up a step, crouching defensively, my pistol in one hand and a shard in the other. Its light pulsed, sending a shiver down my spine. You'll see me again one day. You promise? I promise. My mind closed around the memory like a lifeline, and I was lifted along by a chain of images surging around me, pushing aside my doubts. I remembered Putai's irascible tutelage and Salieah giggling at my stories. I felt the jolting motion of crossing the desert on Amak, the evil-tempered camel, and the simple joy of paddling my bare feet in an oasis. I remembered the way Putai had combed and oiled my hair, and the smell of charcoal as she sat drumming in Horus's temple, helping to guide me in my visions. The mnemonic avalanche became more recent. I felt my heart falter at seeing Werner's face again, and the awe of standing in the Hall of Seasons. I remembered the way Kurtis had held me, even as he stole the painting I had sweated, bled, and fought for, and the deep-seated trust inspired by his cocky half-smile. The smell of Janice's cigarette and Bouchard's expensive cigars blended with the atmosphere of a Parisian morning, and I heard the cold crunch of tires on snow as Ludwig pulled his car up in the shadow of the Strahhof. 1 billion moments had led me to this, every one of them precious beyond measure. Do you know? It's going to be a real pleasure to shut you up.
In episode 19 of Tomb Raider, The Angel of Darkness, Lara Croft and Salieah were played by J.R. Milward. Kurtis, Trent and Pieter van Eckhart were played by Adamm Khuevrr. Written and adapted by J.R. Milward. Based on an original story by A. Murti Schofield. With music by Peter Connolly and Martin Iverson. Additional sound effects courtesy of www.freesfx.co.uk, the BBC, and the YouTube Audio Library. Produced by Stephen Milward. Lara Croft and Tomb Raider are the property of Crystal Dynamics and Square Enix.